after lunch. We'll try to keep this entertaining and light. So this panel today, we're titling it Move Fast and Build Things. So accelerating resilient space industrial mobilization with the Defense Production Act. This is it's a mouthful. We have Defense Production Act in the title, but we'll see what direction things go on that. So kind of the context for this again is, the context here is if there's putting in the context of a Sputnik moment, so everyone's aware Sputnik in 1957 was a strategic surprise. Of course, there was a space race that was ongoing, but the Soviets beat America into space, and of course that was really alarming because if they could orbit a satellite, they could orbit a nuclear weapon, and that would be a bad day potentially. So we're gonna take some riffs on that and explore that, and I have some really great panel members. Really excited to have everyone here. My name is Brian Bowen. I'm the Principal Director for the Commercial Space Futures Office at the Aerospace Corporation. We provide a lot of, we're kind of at the forefront within aerospace and within the FFRDC world at looking at integrating commercial technologies and looking at what I really call the space innovation base, which goes beyond what we might call commercial, or what might be traditionally called commercial, and looking at how to integrate those rapidly for the benefit of our national space architecture. We've also got Carla Smith-Jackson, who is the Senior Procurement Executive and the Deputy Chief Acquisition Officer for your National Aeronautics and Space Administration. We have Mike Patton, Vice President for the Product Center at Lockheed Martin. Really interested to hear a little more. We'll come right back to that too, on what that means for Lockheed Martin. We have Melanie Preisser, who's the Executive Vice President for York Space Systems, and Uyen Dinh, the Vice President for Government Relations and Strategy at BlackSky. So very diverse panel. Ms. Jackson, I'll turn it over to you, ma'am, for a couple quick remarks.
Yeah, so I want to first thank Ascend for inviting me here and having me an opportunity to be on such an esteemed panel. As the Senior Procurement Executive and Deputy Chief Acquisition Officer, I'm responsible for spending about 80% of our budget, $27 billion a year budget, on procurement and acquisition. And so we have a number of initiatives going on right now at NASA as we think about NASA 2040, how we're going to do business in the future, and looking at ways to streamline things like our Moon to Mars program, which is chiefly what we'll talk about here, as well as our science program. We have an aeronautics. We always say the first A in NASA is aeronautics, and then our space technology program as well. So we do varied things, and we have lots of fun, different contracting types and different procurement strategies. And I'm also responsible for training and kind of equipping, quote unquote, the procurement workforce. We have about 800 procurement workforce, and then about another 4,000 in the supporting acquisition area. Thanks.
Outstanding. Mike.
All right. Mike Patton, Vice President of Product Center within our space business area at Lockheed Martin. It's a newly created organization. Actually just started it up back in October. And what this is really about is looking at a lot of our products that we make internally and trying to get a more common thread amongst those products. And so when you think about the supply chain, we think about your processes and things like that. A lot of our solutions have been very bespoke to the missions that we served. And there's a common thread that we can drive to where we can drive more commonality in those products that we use, which then leverages more of the supply chain. And so we're trying to make our supply chain a lot more robust, more cost effective, more schedule effective by doing that. And so it's been very exciting putting together this team, really kind of changing the culture of how we think about products within Lockheed Martin.
Outstanding. Ms. Preisser, you have some charts, I think.
I do. How do I do this? Oh, go back. Okay. So, Brian, I have to credit you for the awesome title for this panel, Move Fast and Build Things. And I'm really excited to explore how we do that with my new friends, Carla, Mike, and Uyen, and Brian. Because I really do think that to arrive at this different destination, you got to take a different path, and so that's what I put on my first slide. So I, just by way of introduction, Melanie Preisser. I grew up in the Air Force. I'm an engineer by training, and while I was in the Air Force, I got to work all the big acquisition programs, think space-based infrared, think NRO and intelligence community programs. And so that's how I grew up. I popped out into industry about 5 years ago and have been having a blast ever since. Today I'm with York Space Systems. We're a commercial space company out of Colorado, and while we're known for building this family of very versatile spacecraft platforms, we're also a turnkey space solution provider. So we work with the premier payload providers, we work with launch service providers and acquire them or use customer provided launches. Same thing with ground. We work with commercial ground terminal services or integrate into the customer's ground systems, and then we provide operations. And so I think my message there is we get to work with the entire ecosystem when we deliver space missions. And so I'll just close my opening remarks with, I'm really proud to be a low-cost mass production leader delivering missions, space missions, not just for our US government customer, but also for our commercial customers. That's it.
Awesome. And by way of a video, I think we have Ms. Dinh.
Let's start the video.
Hindsight is 20/20. Foresight is a superpower. BlackSky. Today, the speed of space-based intelligence meets the urgency of the moment. Unexpected events around the globe suddenly and dynamically alter relationships with allies and adversaries, force rapid national security decisions, and impact the health and safety of entire populations. When you need to act not just fast, but first, harness the power of a superpower. BlackSky.
So hello, I'm Uyen, and I'm with BlackSky. Now you know everything there needs to be known about BlackSky, if that commercial wasn't clear. But in very just a few short words, we are a data analytics company. We also own and operate and also build our own satellites. We have about a dozen small sats right now in low Earth orbit. We're building our next gen satellites, and that will be at 35 centimeters. So right now, our 12 satellites, we call them birds, are orbiting the Earth, and over key regions, we can image up to 15 times a day. I am not a math major. I don't know what 12 times 15, but that's the max we can do. We take those images, we process that with RF, SAR, synthetic aperture radar, SHIP AIS, OSINT, social media. It's all ones and zeros to us. We are source agnostic. We fuse that together, and we give the analyst a product. So he or she does not need to sit there and look at multiple screens, flip through multiple media sites. Is this hoax? Is this real? Is this like a natural disaster versus a man-made disaster? We do all of that. And so there's not a question of, is that a cow or is that a tank that I'm seeing by this certain area? So that's the future, and our most forward-leaning customers are saying that in the future, a very near future, they don't want the image. They just want the insight or the analytics to allow them to do what they need to do. So look forward to your questions and having a conversation with my esteemed colleagues.
Outstanding. Well, thank you, everyone, for panelists, for being on here. I want to remind everyone, I think we've got QR codes and things for submitting questions. We'll, if we see them, good questions, we'll work them in as we go. If not, we'll try to save some time at the end. But I love what was in that video, was harness the power of a superpower. I think that's really kind of the theme of what we really want to talk about today, too, is and sort of how that's changed since 1957. So, you know, some really amazing little quick history lesson. I am blatantly stealing this from the Office of Strategic Capital and part of their talking points. But three key things happened after the Sputnik launch in 1957. One was the creation of NASA. The second was the creation of the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or now DARPA, Advanced Research Projects Agency. And the third was the creation of the Small Business Investment Company program, which actually was sort of the beginning of harnessing venture capital and sort of directing venture capital into government, into solving government problems. That's been, that's kind of come back around again within the Department of Defense and other agencies. So we talked about a Sputnik moment. What might a Sputnik moment be? I'm interested to hear from our panelists what their thoughts on that, what that could be in or a new Sputnik moment might be. But really, we want to focus on how the landscape has changed. Our industrial base is very different than it was in 1957. Our government agencies are very different than they were in 1957. And so, first I want to start actually with Mike. So with Lockheed Martin has a very deep and wide family tree. It was long before kind of the early days of aviation and commercial and sort of just aviation in general. So, Mike, your thoughts on how things have changed? You talked about transforming the way Lockheed Martin is getting after the problem. Can you give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so you think back to the Sputnik moment, you had large companies like Lockheed Martin that were viewed as the integrators, so to speak, of the supply chain and being able to get that bespoke solution out. And so they could help kind of coordinate that supply chain and get everybody kind of in line as far as what capacity was needed, what products were needed, and who was delivering what. I would say fast forward to today, a lot of that has been disaggregated. And so if we did have another Sputnik moment, how do we bring that back together? I think it would be a lot more challenging than it was back then. Not to say that it can't happen. You still have, Lockheed Martin is able to integrate and things like that, but that's why we're making some of the changes that we're doing to make those products that come through that supply chain simplified so that way you can utilize a lot of that diversity that we have in the supply chain now. And so I think those are some of the key tenets that we got to make sure we're driving is how do you leverage a level of commonality to still be able to give a bespoke solution that needs to solve whatever the problem is that we're trying to do. And that's by identifying what that capacity is, where the shortfalls are, who's going to come in and fill those gaps, and then be able to deliver for the customer.
Okay. Awesome. So the results of, after Sputnik, of course, the space race had kicked off hardcore. We had, several years until Apollo landing on the moon, which was our crowning achievement in the early space age. Again, the industry's changed. There was a lot of work that went on between there. There was Mercury, there was Gemini, and Apollo program, and so on. So today, though, we have this sort of agile and fast space revolution that's underway. So Melanie, I wanted to ask you about kind of that this new era of agile and fast space. It's backed by venture capital that was initially brought in through that small business investment company effort. What does a whole of ecosystem approach look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I think I'll answer it this way, Brian. One of the beautiful things about being a commercial company is that we can make business decisions outside of the budget decision-making cycle of the government, right? So, it's... Sorry, Carla.
That's what it is.
So let me give you a couple of examples of that. Right? So we can build inventory ahead of need. That's really important for accelerating schedules. We can even build new facilities to meet market demands. That's not normally things that we can do if we're waiting for a program to be funded. I can be exploring partnerships with various really smart payload providers or service providers in the industry to enable us to deliver missions, either for government or commercial customers, more efficiently. And so that's kind of the power, I think, of being able to leverage private equity and being a commercial company.
Outstanding. Carla, so, early days, of course, in a crisis, existential threat to something like NASA just recently did the DART mission, asteroid redirect mission. Spinning up with Artemis right now. We're going back to the moon. So, how has the role of the government changed? Do you think? What's new about how you are looking at these kinds of problems, and what kind of authorities are out there that either in terms of acquisition authorities and that sort of thing that maybe allow you to, more new tools in the toolbox, for example?
Okay, so I'd first like to give NASA credit for creating the new commercial space economy. This was a vision that NASA had about 20 years ago with commercial crew and commercial cargo. The thought was we can't be the only user of space. And so I will say, declare victory that a company like was just described, they do have commercial clientele. So the word that we like to use at NASA is collaboration. And it's like a sharing of the load to get to space or to have access to space. With respect to that, there are many different strategies, authorities that we use every day. We use everything from partnerships, which are funded Space Act agreements or unfunded Space Act agreements, as well as contracts, the FAR type contracts, commercial services. In fact, there's a big shift at NASA where we don't buy hardware anymore. We actually buy services, and then the hardware is often delivered incidentally, or it's leased. Like that's the way we're going to buy our spacesuits when we go to the microgravity suit, the new one that's going to be for ISS, as well as the deep space. We won't own those suits. Same thing when we do lunar terrain vehicle. We won't necessarily own that vehicle. We'll have access for the use of that vehicle. It'll be on the moon for 52 weeks. It'll be manned probably for 1 week a year, and then we'll do remote experiments and also commercial access to use that vehicle. So the third component that we talk about besides commercial is international. And so with the Artemis Accords, we have well over 40 countries that are going to the moon with us. And so that's why when you talk about the Sputnik moment, we're never going to go as a nation that's the United States. And my paid public announcement is this is the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, where we walked on the moon just a couple weeks ago. So there it was a national imperative where NASA led with a couple of major primes. We won't go back like that again. We'll have Japan with us. We'll have a number of other allies to do different things. We'll be sharing opportunities with commercial space. There's branding opportunities for commercial space. There will be potentially space tourism, opportunities for commercial space to leverage that. But there still is this need for exploration. It might be for finding new ways of doing things, mining, sustainability, that NASA will take care of. But we won't be everything to everybody. It's more about this providing access to space. So to your other point, we want to be able to leverage access to capital and joint venture. And so one of the things that we've done is about 2 years ago, we kind of put our Moon to Mars architecture out there, and then industry can see up to 20 years what we're going to need and when, as well as a planned launch manifest. And that does allow industry to make investments where they fit in, and in the long run be ready when we're ready to leverage that capability, as opposed to NASA saying, I'm going to contract for this and contract for this and contract for that. And so that substantially is a different way of doing business. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of exciting when you think about it, because we're not driving the economy at NASA anymore. We're kind of riding that economy. So
that's outstanding. So I mean, thinking about riding that economy, when a company like BlackSky, you mentioned you build your own. You're a data analytics company that happens to build and launch your own satellites. And I think you've done some work to help develop some sovereign capabilities. How would BlackSky look at participating in now this something like a new race to address some issue? Considering, I guess, again, how the market's a little bit different today than it was.
So, like York, BlackSky is a commercial company, and we wish that the rest of the government would follow NASA's lead in leveraging the National Security Space Policy, number 27, which says to the U.S. government, use commercial to the maximum extent possible. Buy what you can and build only what you must. The space industrial base in the United States and even worldwide is much different today than 10 or 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was a lot skinnier and a lot taller, or just skinny, period, and taller, and not so jaded. But the industrial base has just grown exponentially in the U.S. organically and through such guidance from NASA, and allowing the explosion of commercial launch, and now you have all types of phenomenologies. And the question is next, I really think, is how does the U.S. government leverage all of that goodness for not just the U.S., but for our allies as in my humble opinion, the Sputnik moment happened in 2005 when the Chinese communists blasted one of their own satellites to smithereens, and that was 20 years ago. I mean, and then the Russians did it a couple years ago, which you may want to look on the net if you forgot about that. So our adversaries are moving very quickly, and because of their totalitarian regimes, they can do so. We live in a democracy. I love a democracy. I do not want to live in a totalitarian regime. I just want to emphasize that. But at the same time, the US government is not taking advantage of, I think, all of the goodness that the industrial base has to offer in light of where we are right now, given our adversaries' pace.
It's a great point. I think in what you highlighted there with other regimes, executing a civil-military fusion sort of strategy, certainly the People's Republic of China has published that strategy in which if you're a commercial company operating in China, you're required by law to basically hand your IP over if the government demands it. We don't operate that way here. So when we think about, and neither do our allies, thankfully. So when we think about elements like the Defense Production Act, so that's a voluntary program in contrast to other nations. And of course, the Defense Production Act was most recently used during the COVID crisis to help produce ventilators and vaccines. That's defense in the sense of helping to maintain national security during a crisis. How do we? I guess what barriers are there now to an effective national response to like a new Sputnik moment? I'd love. Mike, you talked about looking at transforming the supply chain. How is the supply chain stressed today? And what are you seeing, and is that a barrier?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways in which that supply chain is stressed. There's a talent pool shortage. So when you go down to those lower levels in the supply chain, and a lot of them are struggling to get the talent they even need to do some of the things that they need to do. And then there's a funding shortage as well. So, I mean, you think about a Sputnik moment, you need the resources ahead of being able to deliver a product. And some of those companies can't afford to even put those investments in. And so when we were going through COVID, Lockheed Martin, we set up some programs where we were able to advance funding to some of our suppliers to allow them to continue to pay their employees, keep employed, and be able to continue to support the missions that we had to support for our customers. And so I think something like that has to happen. Somebody has to have that be that forcing function that can supply the talent when needed and be able to spread, people around, be able to spread the resources around to those areas that are kind of depressed and things like that, to allow that supply chain, and when I say supply chain, I mean big supply chain, to be able to continue to operate. Because any chink in the armor is going to be the weakness that is going to bring the whole thing down.
And I think that's really important. So you're doing a lot of work. Lockheed Martin is a prime on Space Development Agency contracts, proliferated warfighter space architecture. That's an intentional effort to try and grow a resilient and responsive supply chain through the Department of Defense. So as a prime, I guess, is that factoring into your calculus? And how is that acquisition approach helping, or maybe not working well? Are there ways that can be improved?
Yeah, no, that's actually interesting, because originally big primes, like Lockheed Martin, we weren't considered for the SDA. They were looking more, York and some of the more smaller, nimbler, because of the constellations that they wanted to create. And so that's why we had to do some transformation within ourselves. And so things like the product center that I'm leading came about to help figure out how a big behemoth like Lockheed Martin could become more nimble, right? We don't have the advantage of being like a commercial company where we can, have that advanced funding and things like that. So we do have some mechanisms to go do that, but that is a challenge for us. And so we had to do some transformations to be able to get in and compete, and we've been able to win some of those awards. And it's helped us transform how we think about our supply chain and the resiliency within it.
That's outstanding. And Melanie, maybe a good segue to you as well. Mm-hmm. You're almost automotive-like in the way you produce your spacecraft, in terms of like having a production line and being able to move things through very quickly. What's your perspective on supply chain resilience and that sort of thing? Where are you seeing challenges, and is there something that the government could be doing that could help that?
Yeah, you know, Brian, I kind of Googled Defense Production Act when we were thinking through this panel, preparing for the panel, and I realized from my research that back in 2017, the president already classified satellite components as critical for national security. Mm-hmm. It feels like, hey, you know, the government is using the tools it has to elevate priorities for space things for national security. So I thought about it a little bit more, and I realized then that it really does take a whole village, the whole ecosystem, to deliver a mission. Mm-hmm. So I can have 21 satellite buses ready on a production floor, but I need the payloads to be delivered. I need ground entry points to be available to support initialization when we launch. Oh, by the way, we need launch. So I began to think about, okay, what are those things? How can we use the tools that we have? How can the government use the tools that they have in a more targeted way to help us deliver these missions? So I gave a couple of examples, right? Like, hey, we need more ground entry points in order to support initializing these large constellations of satellites. Mm-hmm. So together in Tranche 1, we're going to put up like 126 transport satellites, right? Ooh. We need things like approved encryption algorithms and keys, and those are kind of a critical path item for us. We need cybersecurity measures so that we can get authority to operate. So what are those things that we need to target and direct resources and thinking and whatever it is to remove barriers so that we can get these capabilities up for national security?
Mm-hmm. Can I add?
Please.
To Melanie's very eloquent remarks? Look, the U.S. industrial base is mighty and innovative, but we cannot read the U.S. government's mind. And I think for too long it was, bring me a rock, not this rock, bring me another rock, not that rock. Well, it might be helpful if you told us, you know, just speaking of rocks, you want it this size, this mass, you want it to be striped, polka dot, you want these. Wow, so powerful, I knocked out the mic. Do I need to repeat? Oh, okay, wonderful.
Bring me a rock.
So from a commercial perspective, we would love to have a more regular engagement with the U.S. government instead of just industry days where they say, hi, everybody, come on in. And it's almost like America has got talent. And we feel like every company comes in and does their promo, and then nothing happens, right? And then you've got all these wonderful small pockets of innovations like DIU, you have AFWorks, you've got Space RCO, we can go on all day. But those programmatics, those are, we call them 61, 62, 63 DARPA lines, they don't grow up. They're stunted, and then they fall into this, what we call a valley of death. Mm-hmm. So just foot stomp on Melanie's much more eloquent points. The U.S. government could really better itself in terms of like, and leverage, and at a lower cost point too. Mm-hmm. And also this helps the economy, it helps the tax base, and it also helps our future because whether we want to admit it or not, we have a huge supply chain issue in terms of engineers and STEMs. I mean, I wish I scored higher on my SATs in math because clearly that is the future. But we don't have enough engineers, and they take a little bit of a time to grow up and learn and, you know, become PhDs and all that good stuff. But I don't know about you all, but like we kind of joke in our field that we're up against the FANGs. You know what the FANGs are? The Facebook, Amazon, Alphabet, Netflix, Meta, GE, Google. Did I miss anybody? Because those companies will pay very big dollars for engineers, computer scientists, you name it. And all of us are competing for the same talent.
Yeah. I'd like to jump in. I hate to have to defend the government, but I'm on the government. So we do have a number of, I'll say, built-in barriers. One is the budget cycle. Two is the, I'll say, the will to continue to invest in programs that are developmental but not paying off in the timetable that we expected. And so sometimes we're a bit schizophrenic about what our needs are. I worked most of my career in DoD, Missile Defense Agency, and the threat evolves and changes. So sometimes we think we know what the threat is and we try to get ahead of it, and then we have to change. So our ability to be able to stay with the program without a lot of changes is difficult. So that's the one side. Now, I'll say for NASA, that's one of the reasons why we did the Moon to Mars architecture. We showed the whole manifest through Artemis 10 so that people can see this is where we're going, this is where you need to make the investments. And then we do have a funding profile, but that doesn't mean that that budget's going to be passed, right? So that could change. So that's why we want you to have the commercial investment or opportunity so that until we get our stuff in gear, you can still be making investments. Now, where I see opportunities for the government is instead of just a pure national defense focus, which is what DPAS has, it's basically national defense, there is a capacity challenge that we have through the supply chain and the space marketplace. And so for that reason, we need to have that talent and those skills. And a lot of it's in the technician area. It's not the most, master's degree or PhD level, but sometimes it's the lower skills. And I think there's an argument to be made that you could ride the commercial space and it does feed the national defense because then you have capacity when you need it. As far as facilities investments, if you go back to the 60s and you look at Apollo, one of the things when DPAS came out, Apollo program was the first civil program to have a DPAS rating. That letter, that imperative came from the National Security Council, and it came to NASA. And so they were directed to give NASA a DX rating because at that time the thought was we need the civil space program to be able to maintain dominance, which would enable the defense. We have a place now where we're kind of divorced a little bit. Maybe we're just separated, where defense is doing one thing and civil space. We get together at a DARPA level or at a research level and we share a lot of research, but when it comes time to enable the systems, there's there's rules and statutes. If it's a defensive system or an offensive system, or if it's a civil system, and so there's laws we can't cross. Now, if there was a way to make that argument, think about the capacity and the capability that the nation could do, and I could think of intellectually a way to do that. But right now we're kind of bifurcated. And then when you throw in the intelligence side of the house, which I also worked in for a while, they're also doing some things. But what we all share is the same supply chain. The same floor work. So it is a bigger national problem as far as what the government could do. So I'm arguing both sides. But I don't know that we put on our big idea strategic thinking cap. And that's the Sputnik moment to me, because if we did that and then we added our international partners, then you would really have what I would consider a global supply chain and marketplace to be able to work with. The other challenge we have with major primes like Mike was at one time when NASA was stood up, I think you insourced about 80% of the work. There wasn't a lot of contracting. Now for most of our major primes, they outsource or they subcontract 65 to 80%. Okay, so that makes it very difficult to control your supply chain, and the government wants to assist with that, right? So we're looking to make second source, dual sourcing, so there's not a single source issue if it doesn't work out. But there's also a global aspect to that. So everybody doesn't do business with our friends, right? So we have to make sure if we're going to a supplier that might be an international supplier, they don't also have business with China or Russia. And those are things that Mike has to think about as he's developing his supply chain and trying to add that redundancy. So it's a very complex problem. But I do think if the right minds put their brain power to it, I think we could come up with a pretty good strategy.
I think that's a really great comments, and one of the things I wanted to highlight there too is the sort of the barriers in deep cooperation between defense and civil and intelligence, right? So when we look at the commercial ecosystem that's growing,
right.
A lot of these companies they're multi-use certainly, and NASA on its own, DoD on its own, intelligence community on its own are looking at some of the same companies.
Right.
And some of the same capabilities for their own unique uses, and so those uses will be different necessarily for those agencies. So an example that I think has been great for us from the Aerospace Corporation's perspective is as a federally funded research and development center, operating a federally funded research and development center, we kind of sit in between a little bit. So one great example of collaboration, not necessarily cooperation, has been so Department of the Air Force, their SpaceWorks unit has started what's called a Technology Readiness Level Boot Camp, a TRL boot camp. And so that was an effort to help accelerate new entrant technologies, space innovation-based technologies that are valuable. It's at no cost to the companies that are participating. SpaceWorks actually pays Aerospace to open up our labs, bring our SMEs forward. And we recently signed through a contract vehicle that we have with NASA, a data sharing agreement. We're at the center of a data sharing agreement the first cohort that is looking at in-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. So common technology. Defense has their own need. They need to refuel satellites so they can keep maneuvering against a threat. NASA has a need for building things in space and building an economy. Are there authorities like that, Carla, in your perspective? Are there new authorities that, like SBIC was created after the last Sputnik moment? Is anyone, of course, don't want to get into any deliberations in Congress or anything like that. Are there authorities like that would be helpful? Are there things like that should be expanded?
There are, and we have a number of ledge proposals. I think we have 4. We would also like to have the OT authority that DoD enjoys. The Space Act Agreement Authority, which is resident in the NASA charter, makes it such that we have to support the space economy. If it's direct benefit of NASA, we can't use that instrument. Whereas if we use OTA authority that DoD has, it could be for direct benefit of NASA in advance of creation of that space economy. We think we could use that. We're going back to look at modular contracting again. There was this thought that we should put contracts in place through the life cycle so that people could get access to capital for services and all that. But what we're finding is the amount of uncertainty is making it almost untenable to keep up with the change activity, and that drives more cost. So if we could buy in a modular way, that might be better. The other thing we're writing is a lot of competition. You look at a lot of our systems now, we're doing multiple awards. I mentioned lunar terrain vehicle, for the human landing system, for our spacesuits, the extravehicular suit or whatever. So when we have competition, we're finding that we're getting better results, better quality, as well as better pricing. It also causes companies to think about how can I be more competitive in the marketplace so they can expand their supply chain, and that's what this country was built on, was competition, a free market economy. So those are things that are going on, and we do recognize there's authorities DoD has, like with their trade winds and AI. We feel like we're not exploring AI in the way that we should be, so we're thinking about coming up with a trade winds for the civil, I'll say civil agencies. So we're working with DoD on that. And I don't know if I mentioned commercial solutions opportunities. We don't have that authority either at NASA. And so, because I do sit on the FAR Council, John Tenaglia is my counterpart at DoD. So we've been working with them to be able to shape a ledge proposal to be able to get those authorities. But a lot of times when people think about DoD needs this, they also need to think about NASA could use it too, because we do have the same supply chain. We do need those same flexibilities. And so that's what my team at the headquarters NASA is kind of trying to get ahead of that. But we're reactive right now, unfortunately.
That's outstanding. We have some good questions rolling in too on some of that. I'd love to get panel's thoughts on, anyone else want to chime in on that last bit?
Yeah, that behavior that we are seeing where the government is starting to split up contracts and, more competition has generated a level of collaboration as well. So you see a lot more partnerships being driven from it. We've been partnering with other companies in some of these efforts as well. And I think what that does is does a lot of knowledge sharing. It also helps split up some of the resources that are needed to go accomplish whatever mission it is. And so I think that it helps kind of spread the demand that has to happen there and where those resources come from. And so no one company has to go homegrown itself. And I think that helps with that, not only the competition, but building that resiliency within the supply chain.
Sharing risk, absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of the biggest constellations, the biggest constellation is fully vertically integrated. At least there's very little insight into the supply chain. I'm sure the suppliers know who they are, but they're probably not allowed to say much. But it's the diversity of the supply chain, I think, is an interesting point. So, there's a question that came in here about, especially when we think about moving fast, if we have to respond to a national crisis or something along those lines. Companies like BlackSky are very well positioned. In fact, you're doing that now. We saw in the video for over Ukraine, skies of Ukraine, and areas like that. So, question here is, if we want to leverage, commercial space capabilities, especially on a fast timeline, Should there be a federally approved compliance program? This may be interagency applicable, and a compliance program for buying or a buying schedule, kind of like FedRAMP for IT, such that any agency could access that for your capabilities if they needed it.
It depends. It depends on the timing, right? The timing of like how soon do you need this capability, and it depends on the rest of the ecosystem. It's just not. I'll just use the satellite manufacturing as an example, as opposed to our data analytics, which is that's software, that's all the time. But on the manufacturing side, yes, we could definitely be a part of that. But again, it would allow the U.S. government to leverage more than just BlackSky. It would be York, it would be Lockheed, it would be all the companies that have something to produce for the capabilities needed. So that would be a great idea. I mean, you could probably do a GSA schedule too. I mean, I don't know if that's harder or not. Maybe we should just follow NASA's lead. So there are all these opportunities, but I think it's going to come down to timing. Timing and cost and schedule. Those are the three things you can't escape in life, plus death and taxes. So not to be a Debbie Downer, but look, there are lots of ways the government can be creative, and we've seen it, right? We've seen it with the DPA being used for so many things, the COVID response, the hypersonic, there's like lists and lists of things. So it's not a matter of new authorities or even, again, this is my humble opinion, just me speaking, it's a matter of how do you take the best parts of the DPA and also figure out like who and what is doing it already and leverage that in the commercial sector instead of trying to create something to fulfill, a very niche thing. And if it's so niche, maybe good enough. Again, it depends on I'm going to go back to the timing, because we can produce all the satellites we want, but we need a ride to that party, and that's going to depend on our launch friends.
I was going to say, if you don't have the capacity to launch it into orbit, it doesn't really matter.
Yes.
Which, great question. I mean, SpaceX has been dominating the launch market, right? And there was maybe a small moment of panic a few weeks ago when they had an anomaly, and how long are they going to be down? Luckily, they weren't down very long, but maybe a good argument for having some more resilience in
Absolutely.
in those supply, and at being able to crank out volume too.
But kudos to NASA, because without NASA leading the way, I mean, we would still be like trying to thumb a ride to the space station with our not so friendly competimates out in space. So that in itself, the commercial launch initiative that NASA kicked off, and I think in the beginning it was like, but it's been masterful, and now we have many more launch providers, Rocket Lab's in there, and there's a slew of other ones. And as a commercial company, we've hitched a ride on both SpaceX and Rocket Lab. And before I got to the company, we needed a ride to space, and nobody was ready. And an Indian, as in the continent, an Indian space company said, "Hey, we have a rocket ready if you guys are ready." So we shipped it, and they launched it for us. I mean, that's the goodness of having that international partnership. We're all in it together.
So thinking about, the Space Force has proven out some they call tactically responsive missions. And so basically the ability to rapidly integrate a payload onto a rocket, get it into space. Is there a role in that is NASA thinking about something similar, and especially with rapid contracting
So we have a lot of what I'll call projects where that kind of a thing is going on, and there's a lot of teaming with DARPA, as well as we do things with NOAA, and we have a lot of collaborative things that we work with small spacecraft and capabilities. Our CLIPS program, which intuitive machines, and so we're doing a lot of different things. But as we start to do those, I'll say non-traditional things, there's always things that we run into. And so like people would want to hitch a ride on when we're doing clips. And sometimes things don't work out. Something might not land the way we expected it to. It might land on its side or something. So what happens to that payload when you're, so we have to make sure we're not putting too high value of a payload in case something happens to it. But we're doing a number of those things, and what we're doing is trying to push industry to think more innovatively and to be able to make it cheaper to get into space. And I think we're doing a pretty good job with that. I would like to, and I do have a lot of friends at Space Force. where we would collaborate again across civil, and we look at intelligence and we look at defense and say, hey, how can we pool our resources to be able to provide more opportunity or capacity for that?
It's outstanding. DoD recently did release their defense industrial base strategy, encouraging and trying to open new opportunities for new players to enter the market, into the defense industrial base in particular. Is there something similar as NASA? I mean, you talked a little bit earlier about leveraging commercial, but does NASA have a similar strategy? Is it something that you would publish?
They do. So we have a space technology mission director at STMD. They have a number of, they do the prizes and, they different imperatives, broad agency announcements where we're trying to get that information out there, and they just produced a report. But that's the group there that, I can't speak to the details of exactly what they're doing, but they're pushing that as well. We're in the middle of a leadership transition for that lead job right now. And so I think you'll see more from that group as we start to collaborate and pool resources.
Outstanding. Mike, your thoughts on, there's a question here that says if the objective is a global supply chain, or at least one that involves our allies, not just our own U.S. industrial base, who would be responsible for managing that? How would you see that coming together?
Yeah, I think that it has to be kind of homegrown. And it's an interesting question, because I actually had a conversation with part of my team last night around this. Because, for some of you that know, last week Farnborough, right? And so the big air show that comes together, and a lot of different companies over in the UK. And so they had a lot of collaboration and an opportunity to talk to some suppliers over there and talk about how do we partner, how do we collaborate in an international space as well. And so part of that conversation is looking at those countries and what skill sets do they bring to the table, what skill sets are they trying to develop too, because they also want to be able to develop their workforce as well. And so being able to look at, okay, what type of work do we currently have? Where do I have some excess capacity? Where do I don't have enough capacity? And how can I make those partnerships to make that collaboration happen? So I think that has to happen within the companies themselves to go kind of drive some of those partnerships in collaboration with the government, because also too, there's some technologies that we can't share even with some of our allies. And so we got to make sure that we're monitoring that as well.
And a big question for the group in general, do you all see, United States munitions list and the ITAR regulations, export controls and the export regime, is that a barrier today, or does that need a look? I guess it's open to the group.
I think that's a fact of life, personally. But there was one other thing I did want to. We were talking a lot about space and satellites and all that, but we're at also an inflection point on the aeronautics side of the house, which is another one of NASA's missions with supersonic aircraft, quiet aircraft, single aisle aircraft, air taxis. There's a lot of things going on in that space as well that right now is transformative. So it's really interesting to see what's happening in space and what's happening in aeronautics and that crossing. But with respect to ITAR, for us, we have to protect our national treasure, and that is our ingenuity, and we shouldn't be sharing that with the adversary. But that's just my opinion. I'll let you guys.
Yeah, no, I'd like to jump in on that. I don't think that ITAR and EAR are necessarily a barrier. What I would be looking for, both from a U.S. government policy and kind of friendly nation policy perspective, is the demand signal, right? What is it that you want to field in partnership with your allied friends? And what is important to you as a nation or a region? What I've learned from various conversations is, well, normally in Europe, they want to make sure that European companies have a significant portion of a major project. It seems like when you're talking with companies and organizations in Asia, their interest is, yeah, you go ahead and build it, American company, but I'd like you to come build it at my place. And it takes time to learn these interests, and it would be easier if they would just come out and say it.
There are, so we deal with that quite a bit at NASA. There's economic interests that every one of the countries, if you think about the number of countries that have stood up space agencies. In fact, I'm be going next week to South Africa because they just have a space agency. But it's a big jobs and an economy thing for a lot of developing nations that didn't play in this world in the 1960s. And they see it as an opportunity for them to move forward. And we do have to be mindful of that. And we need more talent, right? So we're looking at it as a global access to talent, and that could also be helpful to us.
So on the international front, 100% agree with everyone's comments. What might be helpful is if the U.S. government could lean forward when U.S. companies are in competition with our international competimates. It's one thing for a U.S. company to roll in and say, this is the best, and the golly gee whiz, this is the best of the best. And the international MOD says, thank you very much, take a seat. And I'll just use a hypothetical country like France. And they roll in with their president, hypothetically President Macron, who's the president. It's kind of, and I'm not saying that the POTUS needs to go to every sales pitch that a U.S. company makes overseas. But in terms of like a U.S. government presence, it is a huge thing on the international front. And granted, everyone has their parochial interests, but if we could just have a little bit more star power and firepower from the U.S. government side, I think that would make a big difference as these smaller countries, these lesser-known sovereign nations are coming into their own. Because the U.S. government presence is sometimes everything.
So I have to argue the other side of this. We can't endorse, the government's not going to come in and endorse a company. And in fact, I've spent a lot of time in the foreign military sales area where we have to give those companies an opportunity for them to use their own procurement processes, their own selections, and their own eval criteria. And I'd love to talk to you about that offline. But yeah, I just want to make sure I'm...
That was a hypothetical country, by the way.
I know it's hypothetical, but I just felt like because I'm sitting here, I need to...
Well, I think that'd actually be an amazing topic for another panel with this group, because using commercial to help and allowing commercial to go compete against sovereign interests that are growing beyond their borders elsewhere. One Belt One Road comes to mind. That's the power the West has. I think, in my opinion, that would be a great topic for another time. We've got a few minutes left. I have one more question here that's coming directly for Carla. So hopefully it's a ringer for you. But it says, with the success of commercial services contracts for commercial crew and commercial cargo, it seems like NASA, and you talked about this, is moving more into services, leaning a little bit more into that. Is that the right contract mechanism? I guess when you have new development programs such as LTVS, Suits, HLS, and others, how are you reconciling, I guess, the traditional acquisition 101 approach of bespoke development versus acquiring services, and why is that a benefit right now for NASA?
So I will say some of our acquisition strategies, we had one thought when we employed them, and then some chickens are coming home to roost with respect to, I mentioned earlier about change activity. For some of the FAR contracts that we've placed for services, we don't have designs, and so we're changing the designs. We can't get to the services in the same amount of time. If you really take the time to look at commercial crew and commercial cargo, you'll see they started as Space Act agreements. And those are much more fluid instruments in order to manage changes, to get to baseline designs, and then get to manufacture and that kind of thing. So in some cases, we probably went too fast. In other areas, and I mentioned about this idea of modular contracting, so we are also looking at, do we need to do modular contracting where we say you work to this point with one type of contract or one, I'll say risk posture, and then we switch when we have more information. That's going on, but if you said LTV, so LTV was a multiple award. These were questions that we asked of industry. We did many round robins, visiting plants and vendors and talking to lots of people, not just in the United States, but globally. And so we settled on that strategy as a result of market research. We do have a handful of what I would call more traditional. And what's really interesting is new space is now becoming traditional in some respects because they've been in the marketplace so long. That felt that risk posture was too great for them to play in, a 15-year instrument. But we have to look at the marketplace and make the market assessment. And we did have 3 companies that were able to comply with what we wanted. And so it's kind of a ringer, but we want to go slower in the beginning, try to reduce the risk, try to share the risk, and then go to the more firm fixed price and milestone delivery schedule. But when the market tells us something different, then we have an onus to be able to support the marketplace. One of the other things we're doing with respect to managing risk is what we do with USDV, which is the US deorbiting vehicle to get the ISS out or down before 2030. What we're doing there, what we did do, is we had an RFP where we allowed contractors to choose the contract type and then tell us how they would manage the risk. And that went pretty well. So we're looking at things more like that, like open-ended contracts where industry can come in and say, here's how I can manage the risk, here's how I can deliver against your schedule and against your performance standards.
So could there be benefits? I think if we look forward to a commercial LEO and cislunar and lunar ecosystem down the road, where there's maybe private space stations in orbit, is the intent with things like the suits and that sort of thing is those are now. I mean, that's commercial capability that anyone can use. It's been proven. Absolutely. And NASA's had a hand in that. Absolutely, yeah. And so we're even willing to go back and look at ACT strategies and revisit if and going back to what one of my colleagues here said, we recently, in fact today, released our vendor communications plan, and it talks about how you can talk to NASA, how you can gain entry or entree to talk to the program managers, and we do want to have that open dialogue, and that's why we have that. It's going to be electronic and there's hard copy. So we want people to come in and say, hey, you did this, I didn't compete for the following reasons, or if you're doing this, this would be a better solution. We want to make sure we have that back and forth open communication with industry. And so this is an opportunity to be able to say that, I think your point is well taken from a NASA perspective. Outstanding. We have a few minutes left. I want to give some time for some closing thoughts. I want to thank everyone for the questions that came in. We're going to start with Uyen and work our way down this way. And I think kind of looking ahead, the question I want to pose is looking ahead, what's one thing that, from your perspective, that investors and or companies and or innovators need to think about with respect to getting ahead of a potential next or a new Sputnik moment? What's something that do?
So many things, but we have 3 minutes. So one of my first bosses said, "Blessed those who are brief, for they will be reelected." So I will stay on that theme. Very quickly, the investors are readily available and they want to invest more into space. The challenge is they would like to see a stronger demand signal from the U.S. government. I say that collectively, as in, do you have a contract? What is that contract going to be worth? And then, of course, as York and BlackSky has done, we've gone out and we've raised that money so that we can prove our mettle. So there are space dollars to be funded and to be invested. The challenge is how can we better facilitate that discussion between the U.S. government's demand signal and them, and that's where commercial industry really plays in there. Right now, it's lukewarm at best. Tepid, I think, is another SAT word I would use in there. But to the larger point of what's next. I think the U.S. industrial base, the U.S. industrial base stands ready for any challenges that come down the pike, because we've shown that we've done it many times before, and we're going to continue doing it. But we'd love to have some insight and some guidance, some signals about what is it the government actually needs, how soon does it need it, and no kidding. If things go wrong, what is the backup plan? And we don't want to be all scary Mary about this, but the point is the industrial base is strong, it's mighty, it's innovative, and it's ready.
Yeah, I think what I want to say is that we should resist the urge to go slow in the beginning. Resist the urge to refine that requirement. Resist the urge to study the problem, and then also resist the urge to keep iterating it while we're building it. The U.S. space industrial base is really great at manufacturing. There's a very small subset of, I'll just say all of us, that are good at studying and coming up with a solution. And so let's build it, and then try it out, and then make it better the next time we do it.
So I had an old boss, and one of his sayings was, skate where the puck's going to be. And so I think that it's incumbent on us to identify what the puck is, look at its trajectory, and figure out how to skate where it's going to be, and be able to plan for that future state of where the puck's going to be. Because I think too often we react to what's now, and therefore it puts us on the back foot. And so exactly what you were saying as far as going fast, you got to go fast in order to get where the puck's going to be.
Standing.
So I think from my perspective, it's piggybacking, but from a different perspective. The government does need to do a better job of forecasting our needs and our requirements, and so that's something we've been working on. 24 months used to be, that's when we give you a forecast. We're really looking at 36, 48 months, and if we could do 5 years, that would be even better. So we're starting to have those conversations, but we're hampered by the appetite of the budgeteers and what's going to be supported on the Hill. And so those are just daily pressures that we have to deal with. Some of the other things we would like to be able to do is to incentivize industry to do the innovation. So it might be broad agency announcements, it might be forward-looking things, and then looking at how we can insert technology so you don't go through the valley of death that was spoken about. So that's what we're working on, our ability to do that. But we do have a number of stakeholders, I call them helpers, that we also have to take care of. And we do, unfortunately, live in the fear of starting something and having it canceled, because that has happened. So we want to make sure we say failure is not an option, and that was really never said, but people associate that with NASA. But we don't want to fail, but we are trying to create what we would call a tolerant environment where we can take risks and it's a safe place to fail so that we can go faster. But where you see us, I'll say, apprehensive about going fast, it's because of all the second and third order impacts or effects that happen if we have a failure. Because depending upon the size of the program, if you go fast and fail, you no longer have a program. Yeah. And so we always have to remember from our side that level of risk, and are we being prudent, especially when you start talking about human exploration. So.
Thanks. That's great takeaways from the panel today. I think we really kind of got after the idea that we got to get out ahead of the problem, think before the next a new Sputnik moment. And really appreciate everyone's comments. Appreciate all the questions as well. And thanks again to AIAA. I think we're out of time. Thanks for sitting in on this.